Hi,
Welcome.
Emma. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, of course. For all those, nobody can be watching already by now unless they're just waiting for us to go live. But anyway, we usually have, just so you know, Wendy, we usually have maybe half a dozen or so, depending on what time. We actually might have more now, but most people will watch the replay of these.
Okay.
But welcome to anybody who's here live watching us. Thanks for joining us either on YouTube or Facebook. My name is Bima. I manage East West here in Seattle, but now we are global with our events online, and allows us to meet people and host people that otherwise wouldn't be always coming through Seattle. I know that since COVID, we have added like almost 100 people from Australia have found our
Oh,
bookstore, and I mean, the whole international list of people is over 500 now. We have people that tune in live from the Middle East, from Europe, from Asia, just all over. So welcome, everyone. I am pleased to be introducing our guest today, which is Wendy Garling. She's the author of several different books on Buddhism, specifically on women in Buddhism. First, Stars at Dawn, and we're celebrating next weekend her book, The Woman Who Raised the Buddha. And we'll be doing an event on that as well. But I thought now would be a great time for us to just introduce her to you, and hopefully she can share some stories of her journey in this, and as well as in scholarship in Buddhism. She's a writer, an independent scholar, an authorized Dharma teacher with a master's in Sanskrit language and literature from the University of California at Berkeley. She has studied with the Dalai Lama, His Holiness the 16th Karmapa, and also her root Lama, whose name I cannot pronounce, but I'm sure she can. And hopefully we can get some stories about that. Welcome, Wendy. Thanks for joining us.
all right. Well, thank you again. Thank you very much.
So how did this journey start for you? Where did you grow up?
Well, sort of an unlikely place, and that was Minnesota. I lived there until I was 11, and then my father's business took us overseas. So my world opened up very quickly. We lived in Germany, and that was Europe in the 60s, and Europe was really unfolding then. It was, a couple of decades after the war, but Europe was really booming. So in 7 years, I lived in Germany and Switzerland and became multilingual and traveled a lot. So my world was opening up, but not yet to Asia. I came back to college at Wellesley in the Boston area, and it's really there that I came into contact with Asia. First of all, I had the opportunity to travel. I had some free tickets. It's a long story, but I literally would go to India for 4 days and fly back because I had these tickets to burn.
Oh,
So
wow.
I had some very intense experiences very quickly. And of course, I had to go alone because no one else had the free tickets. So there I was, and just became a real kind of intrepid traveler. But in those years, then I went back to my college environment and started picking up as many Asian studies courses as I could. And so in the beginning, it was kind of pan-Asian, but I was very drawn to the spirituality. But I was near Cambridge, Massachusetts, so there were lots of visiting lamas and gurus and Sufi dancing and all that kind of thing. So I started trying a lot of different things. But I think as soon as I came across Buddhism, especially Tibetan Buddhism, I knew I was home. I was completely home. And that was after meeting several lamas and attending some major teachings. And again, going back to Nepal and meeting Tibetans. And then that's when I knew I was home. So I was really in my early 20s. And I was meanwhile studying Buddhist philosophy and so forth in college.
Thank God for those free tickets.
Yeah, really.
Amazing.
Yeah.
So I know Buddhism nowadays, I mean, of course, the Dalai Lama really is kind of what people think of when they think of Tibetan Buddhism. But a lot in the West is that the focus in the West is just this mindfulness practice, and some of it's taken away from that tradition. What is it about Tibetan Buddhism that really drew you?
Some things it's hard to put words to. I think it was also the environment of being in the Himalayas. I just felt completely at home. I just felt totally authentically there.
Mm.
I related to the people. I related to the lamas. It was probably first just more cultural, and then the more I got drawn into the teachings, I was just very drawn.
Mhm.
And other forms of Buddhism just didn't bring resonate with me in the
Right.
same way. I mean, I
Yeah.
had contact, I had every opportunity, of course, going back and forth between the US and Asia. And also then I ended up moving to the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area, which has got everything.
Right.
But my choice, my path was always Tibetan Buddhist,
Mhm.
always.
Yeah, for me, I know meeting different Tibetan Buddhists through the years through East West, there's a real I really appreciate the heart, that you find in that path, um, and the emphasis on the guru disciple relationship too. I mean, I think that's a really liberating part of it, where you don't have to just do it alone. It's not just you and your cushion. There's somebody, a mentor, and really like a vehicle of consciousness that you can turn to and relate to, one on one. It's just so helpful.
Yeah. Well, I certainly agree. I mean, the heart connection I had with not just my root Lama, who I met in India, and that's a story I can tell, but his name is Geshe Acharya Thupten Lodin. He was one of the Tibetans who fled from Tibet at the same time as Holiness the Dalai Lama did. But the heart connection, not with him, of course, but with other very powerful lamas that I met, there are just no words for it, but it changes your life on the spot. And I certainly had that also with His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And to tell you that story briefly, I was in India. This is 1979. Traveling with my husband, and we had sort of a checklist of things we wanted to do, and one of them was meet the Dalai Lama. So we were at the train station in Delhi heading up to Dharamsala, and there was a lama with two monks on the platform waiting for the same train. And he struck up conversation with us, and we became very friendly. And by the time the train came, we had different compartments, but he had invited us. He was also going to Dharamsala. He had invited us to stay with him at his monastery in Dharamsala. So that was the beginning. And then we got on the train. It was 10 hours later or so. We got off the train and we shared cabs. But he said at some point, he said, well, why are you going to Dharamsala? And we said, oh, we want to meet the Dalai Lama. And he said, oh, tomorrow, 1:00, you come with me. That was it. So that was sort of the magic of how these things unfold in India, especially. So there we were the next day with our katas, and the story that I love about meeting His Holiness was we walk across the courtyard, and he steps out of his kind of sitting room area in his home, and I say my teacher, but Geshe Lodin and the two monks immediately began to prostrate. They just hit the ground to do prostrations. And His Holiness was approaching us, and my husband and I didn't know how to do a prostration, but I'll just do what they're doing. And I tried to. So we start to go down to do prostrations, and His Holiness just reaches out and grabs our hands and says, no, no, no. And he's holding us up and we're pulling down. And he's holding us up and we're pulling down. And he goes, no, no, not necessary, not necessary. He says, he said, not for Westerners, that's for Westerners. And then he starts shaking our hands like this, like instead of letting us do prostrations. But meanwhile, the monks were appropriately doing the prostration. So it was such a heartwarming and welcoming and sweet thing for him to do. And immediately, it, broke the ice, and we felt very welcomed, and we had a 2-hour sitting with him. Wow. Mostly it was Geshe speaking in Tibetan. They had that was a business meeting, and he had invited us to come along. But that was the first time I met the Dalai Lama.
And that monk who was at the platform, he became your teacher, right?
And that was Geshe Lodin who became.
Wow.
Yeah, and so we, after the meeting with His Holiness that afternoon, they got right back on the train, the monks, and went back to Delhi and went back to Australia, actually, where he was based.
Mm.
And so I just felt such a strong connection with him that for years after that, I just had this longing to see him again.
Mm.
So we stayed in touch by mail, and Australia was a long way.
Right.
And then by that time I had a young son, but we went to Australia to see him. And I asked him at that time to be my teacher.
Mm-hmm. It's amazing. Yeah.
Yeah.
When you said they got on a 10-hour train ride to have a meeting, it really sunk in, all the email, and phone calls and things that we're so accustomed to, Zoom meetings like this, it's like, oh, they have to get on a train and they have to do this, in person.
Right.
Yeah. And your just comment about India being a place of synchronicity like that, I can certainly relate. My wife went to India on a pilgrimage 4 or 5 years ago, and then just having met people from the subcontinent or from Nepal, etc. There's just a whimsical threading of synchronicity that happens. I can't explain it, but it seems to be unique to those cultures and to that region.
It happens every time I go to India. There's some story like that where I run into somebody that I was supposed to see a week later in Boston, but there I am running into them in the airport in Dharamsala, something.
Yeah, it's cosmic. Amazing. So just kind of turning towards, because I know we don't have a lot of time, but turning towards women in Buddhism, how did you get interested in doing that scholarship, and initially with your first book and now this one?
Well, I was drawn to do the Sanskrit. And when I was studying Sanskrit, we studied kind of a smorgasbord of different types of texts. And I was very startled to find some biographies of the Buddha that told a much fuller story about his life than we normally hear, and specifically the Buddha Charita. So we did some readings in my Sanskrit training in that book, but the book itself just kind of blew my mind because there was so much emotional content, and you never hear any emotional content when you hear the life of the Buddha, but there are passages that describe the heartbreak of his wife when he left, and there are passages that describe and also her anger, actually her very, very raw, ferocious anger at him. And then the stories of his adoptive mother, who my book is about, Mahaprajapati, and her heartbreak when he left home and so forth. And it just opened my eyes to the fact this wasn't a two-dimensional story. That's the way it's normally told. But there's such a human element that came through this text I was reading. So then you fast forward a few decades, because I didn't have an opportunity to focus on that particular area at that time. But I was teaching women's spirituality in a more of a community setting here outside of Boston. And my specialty being Sanskrit, I was bringing up stories of Hinduism and Buddhism and so forth. So I just started casually kind of digging back in, and I still had some of my textbooks and some of, including the Buddha Charita, and I started combing them for more information, more stories, and a lot of these were translated in the 1800s and the early 1900s, and they were so rich with footnotes and bibliography that was just, that was just the direction I headed. I just took a deep dive into all these references, not knowing what I would find, because I was so hungry to find more, because what I had found had been so wonderful. And I just found more and more than I ever expected.
Wow.
And finally, I realized I had the whole life story of the Buddha in front of me, told through relationship, mostly with women, and his mother and his mothers. He had 2 mothers and these other women who participated in nurturing him and helping him along the way. So that was my first book, really, where it was more a biography of the Buddha through these stories. And then the second book, the one we're going to talk about next week, I focused on his adoptive mother, because she has been, I think, very intentionally really erased. I think she's almost too powerful or too important, not powerful in a negative way, but she was so significant. And that's really the focus of my second book.
Interesting. Well, why do you think that is? I mean, you said perhaps even intentionally erased. Why is it would it be too confusing to sell Buddhism to have, a woman at equal, stature? Is it like the Mary Magdalene type thing that we've seen with Jesus, or?
Well, I think that could be part of it. I do refer to the Mary Magdalene issue, and I think, well, at least it was his mother, it's not quite the same. But
Hmm.
I think a very important story that I think should always be told when the life story of the Buddha is told is that right after he attained enlightenment, he was 36 years old, he became violently ill. And he almost died because he hadn't eaten, he'd been fasting, and someone gave him some food, and the food was fine, but he became violently ill. And the story goes that his nemesis throughout his life was the demon Mara, Mara. And so this Mara is always sort of tracking him and trying to bring him down. So when the Buddha becomes violently ill, Mara appears to him and says, "Die, it's time, die, go ahead." And the Buddha said, "No, I just attained enlightenment and I have work ahead of me. I have my work to do." And he said, "I will not be ready to die until I complete the fourfold assembly, that my fourfold mission, which is to bring women and men, monastic and lay, to the Dharma." So he laid out the fourfold, we call it Sangha now, and Sangha is a bit of a misnomer, but the fourfold community, the fourfold assembly. Right then, that was his first really mission statement. It was his blueprint.
Yeah.
And he said to Mara, "I will be ready to die when that's completed." And so you fast forward to the end of the Buddha's life. Now he's had another meal that's killing him. And Mara appears. He's 80 years old now. And Mara appears and says, "It's time. You said you'd do it." And the Buddha said, "You're right." He said, "I have fulfilled my mission and the Dharma is flourishing." And part of the goal was not just to bring men and women practitioners to the Dharma, but that they would flourish also as teachers, because it was important to him that his legacy would continue. So that story to me is so important because women were half of his initial goal. And I, as a laywoman, also want to point up that, laywomen were a part of that too.
Right.
So it became important to me to kind of bring that story to light and to bring to light exactly how he succeeded. Because when he does die, he said, I succeeded. And yet when we look back at the stories that have been told to us, we don't find the women, and we don't find any evidence. We find bits. We don't find much evidence of that success that he himself named. And yet it's there, and I found it's in the stories. And Ma Prajapati was really the leader of not just the monastic women, but the women generally, in bringing women to the Dharma, in fulfilling her son's own mission.
And I'm not a Buddhist per se, although I like to think that I could practice, with any, faith tradition, but I had never heard her name before. And that's very telling. I mean, I've been working in a spiritual bookstore for like 10 years, but I've come across so many books in Buddhism and perused them, and never once has that come up for me. So.
Yeah, well, her full name is Mahaprajapati Gautami. So that name might be more familiar. That's the name that appears in the Therigatha. But it's her long name, and I talk about that in the introduction to my book, this long name and why she has a long name and what the different meanings are. But you're right, people don't know. Or, I mean, I talk to people who've been Buddhists for decades, and they've never heard of her.
Yeah.
Or I say, "Do you know he had two mothers? His birth mother died 7 days after childbirth, and Ma Prajapati was her sister and took the infant and began to breastfeed him and immediately became his mother." And they never knew that. They never knew his birth mother died. And I find that I find that unfortunate. And I want people who are interested or who identify as Buddhists to know these stories.
Yeah. Well, hopefully with this event and with more to come and people reading the book, we'll change that.
I want to do that. Yeah,
these are stories that should be told. And we really appreciate you taking the time to comb through the Sanskrit, which, as you said, was your first love, and to be able to compile all these together. For next weekend, is there anything that you might want to tell somebody who's considering coming to the event? I will say that people can purchase the event and purchase the book in the event and receive the recording later. You don't have to attend live. We will send that out. But any little parting words for people who might be interested before we?
Well, I think these stories are bigger than just early Buddhist stories. First of all, the women that I discover and talk about in this book we'll discuss next week are really the foremothers of all the different Buddhist traditions, including Zen, including Vipassana. This is the pre-sectarian era. And I've often, people say to me, well, you're Tibetan Buddhist, why are you interested in Vipassana Buddhism? Or, you know, and I go, no, this is pre-sectarian. This is the Buddha himself was their teacher.
Yeah.
And I think that the power in the stories is amplified in that context. But even outside of Buddhism, I think these are stories of an incredibly important, powerful, and when I say powerful, these are women who had agency, who had intelligence, who had goals, and who had spiritual aspiration. They weren't. They certainly weren't just standing by. All of the women had spiritual aspiration and are said to have attained arhatship. So I think that these stories of women go beyond also the bounds of Buddhism, and they are the stories of women of several thousand years ago who could be role models for any of us, all of us. And I think they should be of interest to men as well as women. I think we just always get half the story when men tell the story. They don't think it's relevant to include the women.
Definitely.
We will find out a lot more about them.
Beautiful. Well, lots of inspiration then, as you said, for men and for women. For me, when we spend time studying the lives of spiritual teachers and people who lived for self-realization, it's always like good satsang. You know, it's keeping the company of these high souls, and they really do. It rubs off, even like you said, from 2,000 years ago. By spending time with them, you can touch into that inspiration and claim some of that merit for yourself. So
yeah, I mean, some of these stories are just captivating. I mean, for me, the voyage of writing these books has been so profound. I mean, I feel like I've lived in a bubble, and I'm almost sad when I'm done with the book, because I've lived in another world in many ways. And
right.
It's so powerful, and I just feel I've been so in touch with them and with that time, which was really special.
Beautiful. Well, thank you, Wendy. I'm so looking forward to being there Saturday, and it'll be either me or Joseph hosting the event, but I'll certainly be there in the replay as well. So thank you so much for spending this time with us, and we look forward to it.
All right, I do too. Everyone be well.